You're listening to the Ask Drone U podcast. You ask, we answer your drone questions. Whether you're here to turn your passion into profit or you simply fly for fun, we're a community of learners and teachers who aspire to achieve greatness. We are
Drone U.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another awesome episode of Ask Drone U. My name is Paul. You're listening to episode 364. We've got John Rupprecht on again to go over those enforcement actions. Now, you've already heard from Jason Cobbler at Motherboard on his interpretation of those enforcement actions. Now, if you remember, those enforcement actions came down from the Freedom of Information Act. They made a request to find out about all of the enforcement actions. Well, luckily, we've got the man, the aviation attorney, the rapper, and a good friend. I'm talking about John Rupprecht, who's going to break down those enforcement actions for us. John, welcome to the show, bud.
Great. So, hey, thank you so much for having me. And so the FOIA requests that were answered recently by Jason, it's really interesting. The documents that were released in there was, I believe, 23 or 24 enforcement actions that were recently released, and there was a treasure trove of information in there.
It was almost 200 pages, right?
It was it was a pain to read and study. There was a lot of interesting pieces of details in there. If you go through the facts, the numbers, you kind of look at it carefully. It was pretty interesting.
So what did you find? I mean, specifically, Jason had been talking about, there were no enforcement actions for commercial purposes. I know you've dived really deep into this stuff. And I know we've talked about this a little bit, and I'm really excited to kind of get other people in this conversation and kind of discuss how the FAA is defining careless and reckless behavior. What instances and environments were these enforcement actions occurring? And, what patterns are you seeing? Because, again, it's a lot of information. What did you find?
Right. So the big takeaway is of these enforcement actions that were released, these are not all of the enforcement actions going on or have gone on. So there's others that people do not know about. I know about them, but no one else knows about them. So I thought that was a really interesting point. Why so? Is that because of the
clarify why you would know about them, just for our audience to understand why you would know about them and other people would not know about them.
I talk to people call me.
So clients call you, hey, FAA's called me, got an enforcement action. So you're saying you're hearing more of those than what's actually being reported.
Well, there's the difference between just being investigated, but because a lot of people are calling me regarding that, but there are actual individuals who have enforcement actions of some type of notice of civil penalty laid against them, or subpoenas of some sort going on a fishing expedition, similar to what was going on with the Skypan case, or with the recent release of the father and the son in the Connecticut case, where the FAA sent them a subpoena to find out more what maybe other regulations they were violating. So this is not the complete picture. This is just what the FAA gave us. And I can tell you that that's what I do know. And I had to go through and comb it out and try to find out what are everybody's names. I'm like, no, it's definitely not this. And so, we have some leftovers that are not in there. So I'm not going to speak any more about those because it's interesting to see how that's shaking out and why the FAA did not mention that. Another thing I would say is that out of the individuals, out of all of them, nobody had a 333 in effect at the time of the action. So like Skypan, there was a total of 4 individuals that operated commercially. So you had Parker, the Tony guy, there was this company from New York, and then there was Skypan. They all managed to get 333s, except for Parker later on, but nobody had them in effect at that time. So that's kind of interesting because we don't know in regards to the FAA doing an enforcement action, whether or not as part of the proposed penalty, they might just suspend your 333 and your COA as well, in addition to a civil penalty, in addition to maybe a potential suspension of your pilot's license. So we never saw if that could happen. However, I do think that is currently on the table. And one downside to that is exemptions and waivers are not protected by the pilot's Bill of Rights, while certificates are. So currently there is a situation where you could get your 333 pulled, but it's not protected by the pilot's Bill of Rights. Now going forward under 107, it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out because the civil penalties might not matter as much to some people as protecting their 107 certificate. So let's say the FAA came after you and said, "Hey, we're going to suspend your 107 certificate for 90 days or 180 days, or maybe we're just going to straight up revoke it." And that could potentially be very devastating for some of these drone companies because more and more everybody's starting to hear, go check for the 333, check for the 333. Well, when 107 happens, check for the 107, check for the 107, and then you're going to be the guy without the 107. And so there's a little bit more potential sting for getting your suspension. Getting a suspension of your 107 or a revocation in the worst case scenario. Thankfully, you have the pilot's bill of rights to somewhat protect you at that point, provided that you go to somebody who knows what's going on, as opposed to just kind of going to a poser drone attorney out there. There's a lot of them. Get somebody with aviation experience, a background in aviation, not just somebody who coming in to make a quick buck. And please don't go to a consultant. Consultants can't protect you. They can't even practice law in those courts. NTSB, they can actually practice. It is a weird provision there. They don't have to be an attorney. But they're going to set themselves up some crazy litigation issues.
So let me ask you this. Let's get into these enforcement actions. What did you find when it comes to careless and reckless? How was the FAA defining this? Did you see a lot of enforcements in specific airspace, or are we in Class E or G where, it's kind of okay to fly in a general aspect? What did you find, John?
Sure. Out of the airspace violations, I found 15 Class Bravo violations. Out of the 23, 15 were Class Bravo violations. There were 2 that were flying in prohibited areas, namely Papa 56 Alpha, also known as the White House. And you also have there were 4 flying around in the FRZ. Because if you're flying in the FRZ, you're also going to be busting the SFRA, the Special Flight Rules area around the DC area, 30 nautical miles around Reagan. Then you also have 5 were in Class Delta, 3 were in Class Golf, and 3 were in temporary flight restrictions of some sort. So those are the multiple airspace violations. Notice if you total up all those numbers, they goes over more than 23. It's because you had multiple airspace violations going on at the same time. So the SFRA, FRZ, and White House, those are busting 3 airspaces right there, and the Class Bravo. So you want to get, boom, 4 in one shot.
Let me ask you this question. One thing I think that we had chatted about was a pattern that you were seeing with these enforcement actions, that if someone has an investigation, or if someone has an investigation that's brought to the attention of the media, you seem to have a much more different outcome in the investigation, potentially leading up to an enforcement action. Meaning, if Flamethrower Kid from Connecticut posts his video on YouTube and it goes viral and makes national news, we're seeing a very different reaction from the FAA than, say, if Flamethrower Kid put his stuff up on Reddit and it had not gone viral. What would have happened then? Because there are many other cases that people are not familiar with where kids are strapping guns and writing software with thermal cameras on their drones. Like, there are at least a dozen of those videos out there on YouTube that I know of right now. So are you seeing that pattern?
Well, what's happening is in the 23 the cases, some of them went just straight to a notice. Some of them were, those people were repeatedly kind of warned with the FAA letter that mostly everyone seems to get and is pretty familiar with, the typical warning letter of, this is what you need to do. So some of those had that, then it went to a notice, and then it actually went to a final order with the FAA regarding some type of fine. There were a few that the FAA, what they did is they actually subpoenaed the individual. So that was Skypan specifically. There was also the father-son in Connecticut, the Flamethrower Kid. And it seems to be more like kind of like, if you will, a fishing expedition that what goes on there is that they send you the subpoena, hey, turn over these documents, let me ask you questions about this, and they very, very broad categories. One of the actual questions that they ask in there is specifically relating to commercial. Did you monetize the YouTube channel? That was one of the points that they asked in the subpoena. I think it was the second or third subpoena that was sent out to the Connecticut guys. asking if they monetized the channel or not, the YouTube channel. That's a whole interesting discussion there. And then they also were trying to find out more about the commercial nature. When else have they flown this aircraft elsewhere? Because they're trying to find out whether or not that flamethrower or the gun drone were flown in a careless or reckless manner, a violation of 9113, which is a general catch-all. If you are breathing, you're going to be cited with a 9113 violation. So out of the 23 got nailed with a 9113 violation from the FAA. So that's going to be kind of interesting there. And what's also interesting is in the facts leading up to that were being spelled out in the proposed orders. At least 5 of the situations there was a mention of lack of line of sight. So that goes back to our discussion we had previously about the whole FPV issue and whether or not FPV racing is considered careless and reckless. Because maybe even though you fall into a particular view of the definition of model aircraft and also the operational protection, you are still potentially, in the view of the FAA, violating the safety of the national airspace. You're endangering the safety of the national airspace by your FPV racing, because especially you have 5 instances here, and those guys were charged with what? 9113. So that was an interesting point there. There was one individual who voluntarily he turned over his pilot's license to be suspended and for 90 days. Okay, that was voluntarily. They didn't fight that. What also is interesting is that there was another individual, one of the guys who flew over at the White House. He had a student pilot certificate, and he actually offered, as part of the plea deal, to allow it to be revoked in exchange for a $2,000 reduction in his civil penalty. So you have at least 2 pilot certificates being either suspended or revoked there, in addition to everyone else having money issues going on with the civil penalty. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Now, let me see. Out of the regulations that were being cited, none of the regulations were for regulations that would normally be in the 333 exemption.
So okay? What's your point here with that? That seems interesting.
The big takeaway that I find interesting is that when people say, well, nobody's been cited for commercially operating their drone, and I'm like, well, yeah, because that's not anywhere in the regulations whatsoever. The mere commercial nature is what, by the FAA's view, is determining whether or not you need to comply with all the federal aviation regulations. Now, remember, it's not really commercial. It's better to describe it as recreational and non-recreational, because you could have nonprofits in there. You could also have, which do make a profit, but not as much so as the commercial. You could also have environmental agency, protection, watchdog, police department, fire department. Those would all fall in there. They're civil aircraft by definition, and they're never going to fall into the recreational category. So all of those individuals are, if they're aircraft, then they're required to comply with all of the federal aviation regulations. The 333 exemption, what it does is 333 allows the FAA to determine whether you need an airworthiness certificate or not. And so they determine that you don't need that. Therefore, a bunch of the regulations you're no longer required to comply with them, because the FAA has exercised its 333 powers in regards to you specifically. The remaining regulations are taken care of under the Part 11 exemption process, and 3 remaining ones are taken care of under the waiver process primarily, but kind of morphed into the Part 11 exemption process. So what the heck did I just say? What was the point of that? You're required to comply with all the federal aviation regulations. The FAA went through and cherry-picked a few of these regulations here and there, 9113 being the easiest, and then went after individuals. But they didn't really put a lot of effort into fully going after and prosecuting individuals. So when you see an individual with a fine for $1,100, it's not because they didn't do a lot of bad things, I guess, or violations of the regulation, let's put it that way. It's because the FAA did not choose to go after them for all those things. However, with the Skypan incident and at least the 4 individuals in the FRZ, they completely threw the book at them. And what's crazy was they left actually a lot of the regulations on the table. So for one violation of a regulation, you as an individual can be fined for $1,100. And pretty much everyone at a minimum is busting at least 5 or more regulations in any given second. So
let me ask you this question. If the Taylor case goes through, right, if they come back with a decision on the Taylor case, which you are practically in charge of at this point, Could that?
Taylor and I are both working on it. Yeah, he's very involved and he's very helpful. Very smart guy.
Yeah.
Incredibly smart.
That being said, if we come back with a decision against the registration or for your case, meaning that you have won the case, we're kind of taking a step back, registration goes away, would that have an effect on how the FAA deems drones as aircraft?
Well, you'd have some discussions there for purposes of okay, you have the whole aircraft argument, you have the whole congressional authority under the Commerce Clause, and that was delegated to the FAA. There's that whole discussion right there. Then you have another discussion regarding regulations, Section 3 through 3 and the regulations that it prohibits. And then you have also the potential prohibition on the interpretations on the already existing regulations. So you just said something very broad, and there's like 4 little books I could write there on each of those topics. So what the big takeaways from the Taylor case? That's primarily going to be affecting only the individuals flying within the protections of Section 336. So the goofballs that are on the news that are flying their drones in a careless, reckless, unsafe way near the airports, they are still out to get hunted down by the FAA. This is only for individuals operating safely within community-based organization safety guidelines. They fall into the 3 categories of model. They meet all 3 elements of model aircraft. One of them being line of sight, and the FAA's interpretation currently of that is that FPV does not fall into that. So we have to go back. We have to get a 107 in the future. Currently, you got a problem with that. And then you have to meet 5 criteria up above, like operating. So you have like 3 that are definitional, and then you have to do 5 up top. If you actually fall into that whole category, then we're arguing that the FAA has a prohibition on creating a rule or regulation governing those. So rule being an interpretive rule where they reclassify the regulations that are already in effect, which is interesting to note is in the NPRM that was issued in 2015 in February, the FAA pretty much was saying, well, if you don't fall into the 336, if you fall into the 336 category, then the 107 will not regulate you because we don't have the power to do such. But that's interesting to know is that later on when they actually issue the clarification interpretation on registration, that they're saying, well, all of a sudden these are aircraft, and we are prohibited under 336 from regulating model aircraft specifically, however, not generally. And it's like, well, you obviously conceded that point back in February 2015. So your own documents are internally consistent, and the message you're giving out is inconsistent. So that there's so many little interesting rabbit holes we can go down there. But backing it out, the Taylor case will only affect model aircraft of flyers in that regard. We are discussing briefly some about whether aircraft are really fully aircraft for purposes of 14 CFR 1.1, and which way the DC Circuit Court of Appeals goes on that. That's going to be interesting because if they do go, these are not aircraft, then that's going to affect the case with the Mr. Flamethrower guy up in Connecticut because he's no longer an aircraft. Therefore, he's not really under
breaking
the
any laws.
Of it. Well, yeah, he's not under the FAA. He's under somebody else's jurisdiction. He might be breaking a law, but he's not under the FAA's. Someone else has to go after him for some other law, potentially, if there is one, just saying on that point. So that's one issue right there. And then the Part 48 registration, if that is struck down as being improperly created under the APA because there wasn't a good cause bypass, then what happens there is that that's going to get thrown out because it's illegally created. Therefore, you better have a Part 47 registration and go that route so that way you can still commercially operate. That's some of the fallout from the Taylor case. Not so much in regards to these enforcement actions potentially because, I mean, I don't see that playing out too much in this enforcement. The Taylor case will affect other potential stuff being discussed at other enforcement actions. That's probably the better way to maybe describe it in fully fleshing out those arguments elsewhere, because this is primarily a rulemaking discussion.
Gotcha. Well, John, I just want to say thank you so much for giving us the insight that you have, because simply the knowledge of being a certified flight instructor, but as well as having the law on your side. I know you're not LegalZoom, and that may be there their tagline. But I'm just saying we really appreciate everything that you are doing for the community, doing the Taylor case, giving us this information, helping us really kind of see through the muddy waters because they seem to become increasingly more difficult to navigate. But anyway, John, thank you so much for coming on the show. If we want to find out more about you, where can we do it?
Sure, you can go to my website at www.jrupprechtlaw.com. That's spelled JRupprechtlaw.com. On there, you can sign up for my newsletter, which I send out regularly regarding my blog post that I put out. And I'll be putting all of this information we discussed into a blog post up on the website, and I'll be sending out to the newsletter with graphs explaining what I did find out. So you can find me there as well as on Twitter at Rupprecht Law.
Awesome. John, thank you so much. And everyone who's listening out there, as you know, John has provided so much information. If you ever have any legal issues when it comes to drones or aviation in general, I couldn't recommend him more. But anyway, guys, that's going to do it for our show today. Thank you so much. And again, my name is Paul, and you're listening to Ask Drone U.
We believe that videos, images, words, and sounds have the absolute power to inform, inspire, and entertain. We reject indecision, confusion, and vanity, for they work against the community. We are united under the virtues of safety and knowledge. We are a training community of learners and teachers who encourage and energize each other to achieve greatness. We are pilots, videographers, photographers, freelancers, business owners, enthusiasts, experts, and apprentices. We are creators. We are the Drone U.